Oh, wow. Whoa.
Good evening.
Whoa.
Good evening.
Welcome, folks. Welcome.
Welcome to SDS Thursday.
Yes, welcome, folks. I will just say, if you're not familiar with the format here, we've got an interview with Professor Ray DiGiuseppe this evening, which I'll be leading, and that's as a preparation for the event that he is actually running on next month. It'll give you an opportunity, I think, of getting some sense of Ray's approach and also work over a very, very long period of time in working with angry people and anger problems as well. So I will probably pass over to Julia in terms of highlighting what's coming up on the SDS program, because she's much better than I am on the technical side of things like sharing screens. We'll just have a look and see what's coming up, and I'll continue while you're doing that to just let more people in as they come banging on the doors. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Paul. I'll try to speak a little bit before I start coughing again. What I wanted to ask you also to mention in your comments is whether you've done training with Ray. Ray did already. Professor DiGiuseppe did training with us, I think 2 years ago. It definitely was during the lockdown. So whether you've done training with him or not, that's also of interest for us. Or maybe you read his books and something, how you're familiar with our speaker tonight. And I will very quickly share my screen with you just to mention that course which Paul talked about. The course is called Anger, Gender Differences in Presentation and Treatment, and it's a masterclass, 3 hours masterclass, and it will take place on the 3rd of October, not 6th, 3rd of October. And just like we did last Thursday, I've created a special offer for people who are attending this Thursday tonight. So if you are booking tonight, you can save £40 before VAT, but actually it is considerably more. So you will pay, including VAT, only £132 as opposed to 180. It's very easy to find the course, or you can click on special offers, and again on top of there it's Ray's course on top of special offers. So it's very easy to find, no excuses to say no, I haven't found it. It's easy to find, and I hope you will come. So Paul will be interviewing Ray, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat box as they come into your mind, because I will try to monitor and ask as many of your questions as I can. Paul, I'll pass it back to you, and I hope you will all enjoy the evening.
Let me start off just by introducing Professor Ray DiGiuseppe and saying, first of all, Ray, thanks very much for joining us. I know that you're in New York at the moment, and I also understand that you're in the middle of teaching today. Is that correct?
Today's my busy teaching day, but it's a pleasure to take a break. Wish I was there. You know, I would.
I know, but we've got you here in our hearts. Can I just say that? For those of you that aren't familiar with Ray, let me just give you some sort of background on him. So Ray is a professor at St. John's University in New York, and he's the chair of the Institutional Review Board there, and also director of professional education at the Albert Ellis Institute, and has had a specialist interest research-wise and also clinically in terms of practice with anger for a period almost exclusively, if I understand it, for about 25, 26 years. That's actually been occurring, although his whole career, can I hasten to add, I'll just whisper this, because I'm sure you won't guess it from just observing here, his whole career spans over a nearly 50-year period. So he's been very, very interested indeed over the period when he's been involved with looking at anger as trying to get recognition, I think, really, of anger as a psychological problem. We'll probably start off on that in a minute, Ray, about that particular issue. I know that we've talked about it before, but I still, in my heart, think this is a very important issue, as I guess that you do as well. And all of that work that he's been involved in has been in the diagnosis and the assessment and also the treatment of people with anger problems. So he's in the course of that work, he has developed two particular anger assessment tools, both for children and adolescents and also for adults. And not surprisingly, he's published extensively within the field. To my knowledge, and this is probably already out of date, over 120 scientific papers and book chapters. And he's also co-editor of the Journal of Rational Emotive and Cognitive Behavior Therapy as well. So I guess that will give you some indication of our guest's experience and knowledge. I feel quite happy to actually say, folks, that in many ways he is, in my opinion, probably the foremost researcher and practitioner in the anger field that actually exists today. So, Ray, as I say, welcome, and it's great having you here.
Thank you for your kind words.
I just wanted to start off first of all, because I suddenly realized I didn't know the answer to this. I know that you're based in New York now. Are you originally a New Yorker, or did you?
No, I'm not. I'm originally from Philadelphia. And
right.
I grew up in Philadelphia, came to New York to go to graduate school. I actually had a choice in after my PhD to go work with Albert Ellis, and I also had an offer to go work with Tim Beck back in Philadelphia. And I stayed in New York to work with Al Ellis and just never left. I've been at the Albert Ellis Institute.
It's not done you ill, is all I would say on that. Let's start off with looking at this whole issue of anger as a problem. And we could maybe kick off with I guess a shared view of this, which is in some ways anger has been a forgotten psychological problem, in part because it's never been recognized diagnostically. So in comparison with things like depression and anxiety, which have really helped push forward research and practice, the same has not been around with regards to anger. That is correct?
Well, I would say that historically, that's not correct, but recently correct. If you follow the great philosophers who talked about emotions and human suffering, from Aristotle all the way up to the 19th century, philosophers always talked about anger as a major cause of human suffering. The Stoic philosophers, and many of the Stoic philosophers are active in the UK in therapy, they really always focused on anger more than any other emotion. 1902, 1903, we had Sigmund Freud and Emil Kraepelin write about psychopathology. They were two real leaders of abnormal psychology for the beginning of the 20th century and through the 20th century. And they saw anger as related to mania, and mania is part of depression. And then we got this idea that depression and anger were kind of related. And I would blame Freud and Kraepelin for the demise of anger as a diagnostic category. And before them, it was really very much considered as a major source of human suffering. So it's a relatively recent 120 years that people have thought of anger as an unattractive emotion. But it's always been the case. I have this collection that I make of statements and sayings by famous poets, authors, philosophers, novelists on the nature of anger. I have about 200, so if you find some famous sayings, send them to me. And of those 210 some quotations that I have, the majority are negative. The majority of famous thinkers see anger as a problem. Malcolm X is one of the few who don't, and those people who see it as a positive see it as something that can harness our energy to do good, but they're in the minority. Most people see it as negative. So You know?
Okay, well, let's pick up on that, because I think that idea about whether anger can be good or bad is obviously something which has also influenced or come from that original Freudian idea of depression in many instances being suppressed anger, and that it's seen as beneficial, to put it bluntly, to let anger out.
Yes.
And what's your view of that?
Well, this is another sort of interesting thing about anger where most clinicians get it wrong. And the idea was that cathartic expression was going to reduce your anger. And remember that Freud's model was very much, Freud really very much tried to be a scientist and was trying to use the hydraulic metaphors that, hydraulic areas were the real areas of study when he was a student. And so the idea was you build up too much pressure and you're going to burst a gasket or something. And that was the idea. But that was really discredited. And if you look at that scientific research, about every couple, 5 to 10 years, some experimental psychologist decides to study that topic, because clinicians still recommend cathartic expression. And the first person to do that in the 1950s was a guy named Berkowitz. He found that not to be the case. The very famous, social learning theorist Al Bandura picked it up in the 1960s. And so we have about 4 or 5 famous psychologists who've done research. The most recent one is a guy named Brad Bushman at Ohio State University, who has studied cathartic expression in violent video games, and the data is pretty much very convincing and consistent that cathartic expression makes you feel better immediately, but increases the probability that you will respond with anger and aggression. So we really need to tell people, don't go hit the punching bag, don't play a violent video game. You will just increase the probability that you will get angry the next time something happens, although you might feel better right now. So
right. Would you say the same applies to the verbal expression of anger as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, a lot of people do say, I have to say something. I really have. And they say something and then they practice a verbal aggression response rather than an assertive response. So that may be one of the differences. Saying something is a good idea, but making sure that it is a assertive response is important.
Okay, so I don't want to get too in depth with this, but just to summarize that particular point, what you're basically saying is, if I understand this, is that an assertive expression of dis-ease or dislike is valuable, but not an angry expression. Have I got that correct?
And anger is something you're going to rehearse, then you could become really good at it.
Right. Okay. Another sort of common issue that crops up, and I think particularly from a CBT perspective, is that anger, when practitioners are looking around and saying and asking themselves, how do I help someone with an anger problem? There is a natural tendency to equate it as being very similar indeed to anxiety. And so it's very common to simply take a lot of anxiety type strategies or interventions and apply them in the anger field. Do you think that's valid?
I think it's not such a good idea, because I think that there are some really big differences between anger and anxiety, and anger and other negative emotions. If we look at a mood induction experiments and we try to get people to feel emotions, and we put on some EEG to figure out the activity in their brain, we find that most negative emotion produce arousal on the right side of the brain, and then happiness produces arousal on the left hemisphere. And so for many years, neuroscientists kind of believed that positive emotions were in the left hemisphere and negative emotions were in the right hemisphere. And then they realized that they hadn't done these kind of studies with anger. And when they did anger studies, they realized that anger really was present in the left hemisphere with joy. So now we had a dilemma, and they rethought what was the difference in the hemispheres. It wasn't positive or negative emotions. And they concluded that it was a approach gradient emotion versus an avoidance gradient emotion. The emotions that you feel that make you want to avoid this initial stimuli or triggering stimuli are in the right hemisphere. Those that make you want to approach the stimuli, joy makes sense, are in the left. And so anger is the only approach gradient negative emotion. You want to get in that person's face and yell at them or hurt them. And so you have this approach gradient, and it's very unique in that regard. So I think that that's one issue. I think also that most people who look at anger from a cognitive behavioral perspective look at it from the same cognitions that are aroused or present in anxiety and depression. So if you're an aficionado of Tim Beck, you use the same cognitive distortions that Tim identified in depression. And I think people aren't reading his 1999 book carefully enough to look at some of the differences that he identified. And I think the same for Ellis, as people will look at the irrational beliefs and look at the irrational beliefs with depression and anxiety and not pay so much attention to the differences. So what's one of the things that we've been doing research on lately is we think that cognitive behavior therapies are not as successful as they could be, mostly because people are using the same, or they're looking to challenge and change the same thoughts that are related in depression and anxiety. And maybe there's some different ones. Maybe there's some ones that are more unique to anger. Maybe there are some ones that are more dominant in anger. And that's one of the things that we are kind of trying to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting what you say here about the positioning hemispherically with regards to anger as an emotion, which presumably must partly explain people describing feeling good sometimes when they feel angry. And also in addition to that, presumably it's got some almost inevitable implications regarding motivation as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think anger sort of motivates an attack when your resources are under threat. And the difference, one of the big differences, maybe get back to the issue of motivation and difference between anger and an anxiety, is, when you're anxious, you feel threatened, but you think that the threat is stronger than you. So you're going to be defensive. When you're angry, you think you're threatened, but you think you're stronger than the threats. So if you go back to the original cognitive appraisal research that was done, they made this distinction between your appraisal of the threat and your appraisal of yourself. And people tend to have forgotten that second aspect. And that second aspect is really important. And the other sort of interesting thing about the appraisal of your own resources, do you ever notice that we talk a lot today about internet aggression or, cyber aggression? We're doing a study right now on couples and anger and cyber aggression. Well, when you do cyber aggression, Paul, you're a very small feature here on my screen. You're kind of really small and you're very far away. And so I'm going to feel a lot more powerful than you and feel more likely to respond angrily because of that difference in appraisal. If I was standing next to you, which I have done, you're kind of a tall guy, you look kind of tough, I'm not going to be so quick to get angry, So we don't sort of consider all of the appraisals that were done in Lazarus's original cognitive appraisal theory. And I think that that gets us to underestimate where anger is going to predominate.
Right. Well, that's interesting from a variety of reasons. I've recently been doing a deep dive into Twitter, which has been an absolute fascination and a total eye opener along the lines that you're talking about, really. But it is quite interesting that that whole belief, basically, I'll put this very crudely, if I think I can get away with it, actually has quite a big influence on whether people express things or not.
That's right. And if you're stronger, you're going to think you can get away with it.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And I think we underestimate that as a characteristic or a belief system that is going to encourage the person to be angry.
Okay, well, let's just pick up on what I guess might be a question in some people's minds about that, which is, what about people who feel angry but don't express it? Maybe they don't express it because they think it's a bad thing, or that they have certain beliefs about what would happen, which concern them if they express it. How does that work in the same way, or does it work differently?
Well, that doesn't get promoted so much, at least by behavioral or cognitive behavior therapists. And that's why sometimes cognitive behavior therapy might have its limitations with anger. There are people who have what you would call secondary evaluations of their emotions, not the thoughts that cause their emotions or trigger their emotions, but the thoughts they have about them. So Al Ellis talked about this. He called it symptom stress. Wendy Dryden talks about this. Bob Leahy talks about this now in his, emotional schema therapy. So a lot of people do have thoughts about how appropriate or acceptable different emotions are. And if you really have an idea that your expression of anger, and you include in that any even assertiveness, you may really never resolve conflicts with people because you are suppressing your expression of anger or even your expression of assertiveness. And this doesn't get picked up in our assessments of anger. And it may not be something that, I have to admit, in sort of some of my research, it's really hard to develop a methodology that picks this up equally as well as some of the other issues. So I think it is an understudied issue when it comes to clinical anger research. I think it is not talked about in the therapies. And I think that the Gestalt therapists were really the people who had identified this topic that you're talking about the best and advocated that some people, maybe they have too little anger. In other words, they probably don't have too little anger. They feel it, but they have too little anger expression or too little assertive expression and are ashamed of their anger. So yes.
Right. Okay. So that in a strange way brings us back again to the value of assertiveness as a communication style. Sort of connecting on to that issue, and also this original idea of depression being suppressed anger. I also know that a lot of people are very unclear when they are working with anger problems about whether they should work with the anger or whether they should work with some other emotion that is associated with it. I mean, I guess one of the most obvious examples here is a sense of loss following bereavement, but within that, individuals also feel angry. And what are your thoughts about making anger the focus of therapy rather than other associated emotions?
Yeah, I think that you're right that people do this. Whenever I do talks on anger, I usually have a debate with one or two people in the audience who will say to me, anger is really a secondary emotion. It's not a primary emotion, and you want to go for the more primary emotions first, which are always anxiety, depression, grief, shame, whatever the case may be. And so it's a common clinical strategy that people will target not the anger and look for the other emotions. And I think it's a false choice. In other words, if I have shame and anger, and you challenge the thoughts and that lead to my shame, I may be a shameless, angry person. In other words, we don't have good evidence that the anger changes as a result of targeting those primary emotions, those other thought to be primary emotions. And so, I think the same goes with depression. I think a lot of clients experience depression and anger either, kind of correspondingly. They go back and forth for this, and they experience depression, and then they experience anger, and maybe even within a half hour, they may go back and forth several times because their thoughts are kind of unstable. But I think if we get rid of the depression, they're an angry person. If we just treated their anger and not their depression, their anger may go away, but their depression may not. And so I would be an advocate for targeting each affective experience that the client has, and acknowledging the uniqueness of that emotion and working on it, and not assuming that we're going to get other emotions to go away. I don't think yet had good experience or good data on that.
Okay, so again, if I've got that right, you seem to be suggesting that we really ought to be looking at anger as potentially coexisting with other emotions, rather than other emotions necessarily having a causal effect.
Yes,
with regards to anger, if that's correct.
Well, and it's very often there is a issue of when we say, I don't like the word, when we say primary emotions, I think do we mean the basic emotions that Darwin and Ekman talk about? The most emotion theorists have identified basic emotions. You come from that perspective, but you can have a sequential series of emotions, and their occurrence is still important. So, for example, we know that lots of people who commit murders and act aggressively experience shame. And they also experience anger. The shame may come first. That doesn't mean that, and maybe if I did away with the shame, I still might be angry, because I'm angry at you for introducing the information that led to my shame. So if, I had shared some secret with you, Paul, and you kind of revealed it in front of all these participants, I might feel, I probably would feel shame. I'll work on not doing that, but I might feel angry at you. Like, who gave you the right to make that public disclosure about me? And even if I got my shame under control, I still could be pretty condemning of you for having done that behavior. So I think that we do have the co-occurrence of emotions, which is really very common. We don't usually experience one emotion, but they still may have separate paths or separate evaluations that lead to them. So that's the one I would.
And presumably require separate interventions, maybe.
Or separate discussions and separate issues that we're going to have. That's correct, right? So
okay, I mean, while we're on that sort of issue of I guess some assumptions that are often made in therapy about this whole issue. I was just interested to know, over the years when you've been working with therapists, are there any other specific common misperceptions that you tend to find that therapists have about anger and how to work with it? If you were to say, over the course of my career, if only people could grasp ... What particular things do you think that people miss, or are other things they have misconceptions about with regards to anger? And
I think the cathartic one was the basic emotion or primary emotion. And the other is motivation for change. I think that people assume that the angry client, who may be there for, lots of different reasons, wants to change, and I can dive in to just starting to do my therapy. And I think that angry people often get coerced into therapy, badgered into therapy, and even when they come, I'm not sure whether their motivation is to change them or to change those SOBs that are ticking them off, right? And so
Right.
I think people don't get the motivation for change. I think that if we look at Prochaska and DiClementi's stages of change model, actually, at least DiClementi is a relative of mine. We came from the same small town in Italy. You know, I always say to Carlo that he's got the initial stage of change as the pre-contemplative stage. Angry people have an anti-contemplative stage. I'm really opposed to anybody that thinks I ought to change my anger, and that we don't work enough in moving people beyond those early stages of change, because I think people see their anger as good, even though it feels bad. It's kind of desirable. It's noble. It's self-righteous. And when we start in to change it, we often lose the client because they're not ready.
Right. Okay. So I know that we haven't got time to go into this in detail, but what sort of 1 or 2 tips would you throw out, or ideas would you throw out about trying to address that motivational problem?
Well, I think first of all, there are 2 approaches, and I'm always amazed by this. And I frequently go to PsycInfo to run a lit search. There is this very empirically supported intervention that's been developed to work with people who don't want to change their problems, like alcoholics and substance abusers. And that's called motivational interviewing. And people use motivational interviewing for people who don't want to change their problem, have a problem that you traditionally don't want to change. I've yet to find a study on motivational interviewing with angry and aggressive clients.
Really? Wow.
Which seems like the appropriate thing to start with. And second, I think Prochaska and DiClementi have talked about the shift in the evaluation of cost-benefit relationships as people move from a pre-contemplative to a contemplative stage of change. And so what I like to do, I'm not good at motivational interviewing. I can't keep quiet as much as they like you to, you know, but having people evaluate the costs of their behavior, the alternative choices they have, what are the alternative choices and what are the benefits and costs of those. So that kind of thing that Al Ellis called the hedonic calculus of cost-benefit relationship, which Prochaska and DiClementi again say are very much related to moving across those stages of change. So those 2 interventions, I think, are important to do before you get to interpretation, before you get to challenging beliefs, before you get to teaching assertiveness training. And when I see treatment failures in anger, it's often because they jumped in with an action stage intervention before the client was in a action stage of change.
Right. Okay. That again is really interesting. And at the very least, it implies, I guess, that we ought to basically be checking in before we do any work with somebody with an anger problem, checking in with them about, first of all, what their attitude is with it, towards it, and investing some time in that particular process before thinking that we can simply start going ahead and working with it.
And I would go a step further. I mean, I haven't always done this, but maybe part of your intake assessment is going to be the stage of change measure about their attitude towards changing their anger and aggression to see where they are. I do that in a sort of clinical way, not necessarily a questionnaire way, but I wouldn't be opposed to that being part of the intake question packet that you're going to put in there. Right.
Okay. Well, that again is interesting. One of the things that crossed my mind when I was sort of preparing for this evening was, it struck me, and I don't know why it hadn't struck me before, but it struck me that working with people who are angry, whether that expresses itself in physical violence or whether it expresses itself in verbal aggression in some particular way, broadly speaking, these are not experienced as being nice people. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about spending so much time with angry people. Is it what's that like?
I kind of really like my anger group, which I had last night.
Right.
And every year I usually have a different intern co-lead the group with me. And the new intern that started with September just said to me, these are really nice people and they're so supportive of each other. You know, they really are supportive. And it's kind of a more fun group because they're much more active. Like, I don't think I could go back to running a group for depressive people. It's too morose.
Right.
So they're very active. They really want to participate. Once they're committed to change, they really are going to, you know, talk a lot and be engaged. So I find them not to be totally evil. They have a lot of positives, and I think that the attitude that clinicians have may keep them away from working with angry people. I find it really energizing to see them do this. One of the strategies I use with them is I want them to report to me each week a opportunity or an activating event that normally would have gotten them very angry, but they think that they responded differently to this week. Right. And when they report those successes, they really feel good. And usually there's other people who were rescued by the clients not responding in the anger response as well. So I find them to be very energizing clientele to work with.
Well, I guess that my first thought on that is this is a good illustration of the energizing nature of anger to some extent. Would be the first thing. Do you think this is something, I mean, do you think this is something which, I mean, you mentioned the skill of the practitioner, and I understand that in terms of where the dialogue will go to. How much of this do you think is a product of being in a group rather than working with folks individually, or do you not think that makes that much difference?
No, I don't think it makes that difference, because I've had people that I've worked with individually where I do the same thing, and that we're able to you know, have that dynamic, and that works out pretty well. Right.
Okay. So to bring things round to the masterclass that you're running on the 3rd, you're going to be looking at some of the more recent research, I understand, that you've been involved in terms of the assessment and treatment of anger, but specifically from a perspective of gender differences. And without giving the whole game away, I just wondered if you could say a little bit about, you know, the research that you're currently involved in, and some of the pointers that you think are coming through from that.
Well, I think there's 2 ways to do this. Look at this. Number one, we've sort of summed up a lot of data that we've collected over a long period of time and have done 2 things with that data. First of all, we're kind of looking at just what are the gender differences in our scales over, you know, because I think people do assume that gender is the issue here, and that men are more likely to be angry and aggressive. And we've got about 2,000 people in our data set now, and that what we found is it's really hard to find gender differences that people assume to be there. The one gender difference that's really obvious and accounts for a lot of people's concerns is that men have more upper body strength. And having more upper body strength means that whatever damage they can do, they're going to do more of it. Right. So that's really, and it's really hard to get around that. So for men, they have to be aware that they can be scarier and that they can do more damage. And I don't think that they're not really aware of that. They don't become aware of it, or if they are aware of it, they may use it to coerce people. So that's a difference. But otherwise, differences don't show up as much as people think. Now, here's another side effect. When we do anger studies, you know, we very often use social media. I always like to get a large enough sample from as many different countries my new strategy is to try to get as many people as I can from English-speaking countries, because my questionnaire is in English, and I've been trying to get New Zealand, Australia, Canada, even that England country, and get the Scots in there, and South Africans, and the Irish, and we get more women who want to participate in anger studies than men. So we can't say that women aren't interested in the topic. Like the idea, like participate in the study, we want to know how angry you are about, they are really in there participating. And we probably get about, 60 to 65% of subjects in any recent anger study being women.
Wow.
Which is really, really interesting. On the other hand, they don't show up for anger related treatments.
Right.
In other words, maybe like 20% of the people who come for an anger treatment are going to be women. And so they don't, it's sort of interesting, like, why don't women think anger is a problem for them?
Right.
And are they less likely to participate? And some of that may be, that maybe they think all the participants in the treatments will be men. Another issue is we tend to get angry at the people closest to us.
Right.
Which is our romantic partners. And anger really matters there. And people tend to make very overgeneralized condemnations of members of the sex that's hurting their feelings. And so you have lots of irrationalities about the other sex, and that we really want to address.
Right.
And I guess another point is we just completed, give credit, my doctoral student, Kate Romero, just took a very large accumulation of data from many people who've taken our longer anger scale and done what most people would see like a cluster analysis. It's really new latent modeling profile analysis to look at anger types. We get very more meaningful differences when we look at subtypes than if we look at scores on scales. Looking at the difference between are men or women more angry on an anger scale, we don't get, we get significance because we're using large N's. You have 2,000 people, very small differences are statistically significant, but they're not really meaningful differences. When we look at profile types, we get some very meaningful differences. We have some profile types that are, where women are dominant. Now, most of the profile types, there are no differences in the number of men and women in there, but there's a couple that really are that tell us how we might want to look at those differently.
Right. Well, that feels to me like quite a good point to bring things to a conclusion and leave people hanging there in order to find out more about this when you're running your masterclass on the 3rd.
We are not wrapping up quite yet, Paul, because I do want to ask a couple of questions.
Yeah. Okay.
First of all, I wanted to say I knew that this will be a problem because whenever Paul talks to Ray, he never can stop. They can talk together for hours, especially about anger, because Paul is interested in that topic and Ray obviously is a world leader on that topic. I just wanted to take you through very quickly through several options. If you found tonight's Thursday interesting and would like to know more and hear more from Ray, you have 3 options. One is on SDS Seminars Online website. We have last year's Ray's Masterclass on assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of anger disorders. So all the basics, all the essentials are covered in that masterclass. It was a full day, 6 hours masterclass. Ray had to get up at something like 2 in the morning to join us in the morning. And it's currently on special offer. So if you want to go through all the basics and hear all the essentials about our anger work, go for that one. If you want something much briefer, and in conversation with Paul, again on special offer, we have a conversation between Paul and Ray, demystifying anger. And it's only £36 at the moment, so it's a good value for money option. But if you want to, I don't know, can you see this SDS screen now, Paul?
Yeah.
So, but if you want to explore the gender difference between men and women and anger, that's our live masterclass on the 3rd of October. So I just wanted to emphasize these 3 things and now to go for the questions, because I loved the questions we received today. So Renata is asking, as a creative therapist, please, can I get your views about inviting a client to express anger through creative art, through painting, clay, and so on? How about that, Ray?
I think I would have 2 comments on that. We don't want to get them into too much expression of destructive things, but it's very often people don't have an awareness of what they're angry at. And I think that those creative expressions, if we say, here's an activity, there's something that you're upset about, use your creative abilities to sort of let us know what you're feeling, that's probably an excellent use, because very often people have difficulty. Sometimes it takes them, a long time to figure out that I'm angry, because they're not supposed to. And second, I think that we want to get them to do 2 things. How would you express it, and what's the better way that you could express it that's not destructive? And they can tell stories, develop poems of adaptive anger. So what is the adaptive anger, and how does that look different from your destructive anger? And I think that the creative arts would really be helpful in helping people see and understand those differences, because we're not real good at helping or having things in society that demonstrate adaptive utilization of anger.
Thank you. Thank you. It was an excellent question. Sean is, when we were talking about anxiety and anger, Sean asked about intolerance of uncertainty and whether it plays any role in anger.
Interesting. I just kind of was reviewing a paper on this issue of intolerance of uncertainty, and I can say that I know of no good research that has looked at those concepts, because this idea of intolerance of uncertainty is becoming a much more research topic. However, clinically, I could say that that's one of the things that does trigger angry people. I would think quite often they don't know, and they become really angry at the people who are supposed to let them know, the people who have the answer that they think and are not sharing the answer. And sometimes they're very, very condemning and blaming of the people who they think should have the answer. Very often they don't. The people they think should have the answer don't have the answer. So I think that, yes, that's an important topic. Yes, it's an understudied topic.
Thank you. Maybe something what our colleagues can think about. Ian is asking about the link between anger and violence, and if there are any certain aspects of anger that inevitably lead to violence.
Well, this is one of the major problems, is we do know that anger is often present when people commit violent acts. We also know that the majority of anger episodes, even amongst the most aggressive people, don't involve aggression. So if you are an angry, aggressive person, maybe your aggression occurs every, 6 or 7 times that you get angry. And we have not really looked at that we can say this is what makes a aggressive an angry non-aggressive episode different from an aggressive anger episode. I think that somehow it's related to a discomfort, anxiety, and discomfort intolerance. Like, I put up with a lot of this. I can't put up with it anymore. So if someone does something I don't like, I can forgive them once, I can forgive them twice. Fourth time, I've had enough of your shit. You know, and there's some idea about how much you think you're able to forgive or able to tolerate that may be there. So I often say to people, who says how often you can tolerate someone behaving badly? Maybe you can tolerate it 10 times. Maybe you could be more forgiving. Maybe it's stronger to be more forgiving, but you're deciding rather arbitrarily how many offenses the other person is entitled before you retaliate against them.
Thank you. Michael is asking and commenting, saying, in our distant past, would anger not have conferred an advantage to the individual?
Absolutely. And that's really the issue, is all of our emotions probably have had an evolutionarily adaptive function, and that's how we got them. And the problem is, do they work in present society where we have such close quarters? So most anger theorists believe that anger had an evolutionary function of helping us protect or acquire important resources, and that worked. I don't know if it works now when I'm on the subway or driving on an expressway, but it did. And I think that's really the key.
Yeah. Delisha is asking, maybe many women are wanting to learn about anger in order to feel safer around men. I think it's a comment about women entering your surveys. What do you think of that possibility?
I think that's true. I think that in dealing with angry women, there is a recognition and a fine line between not being angry, but being appropriately protective and what's the word we might want to use? Empowering. We have to, when you're angry, you're very often not thinking of the adaptive way to respond. We want to leave you aroused and empowered and still able to respond. And too little affect could be a danger.
And the last comment is from Bradley. Can you speak to the idea that all emotions are there for our benefit, and speaking about anger's benefits, for example, anger helps overturn injustice?
Yes.
Because we are very quickly coming to 8 o'clock. I will be very happy for you to answer, Ray, but actually I know that this has been addressed a lot in your last year's.
Well, let me add one piece to it. There's not very much written on this. So yes, all emotions are adaptive, and all emotions probably evolve for good reason. There's an African-American philosopher at University of California who's written a very controversial book, very interesting book called The Case for Rage, and talks about how to develop an adaptive anger and a productive anger. Her name is Maisha Cherry, and she's done a better job at identifying this anger at social injustice than anyone else. She does have a tradition of coming from some other women that she mentions in there. So Maisha Cherry's work, while it applies very much to racial injustice in the States, I guess you have your own racial injustice over there as well. I think Maisha Cherry has done the best, and my research team and I are trying to follow up on her work and come some empirical validation of it, but really top notch.
Thank you. I want to say I can listen to Ray forever, and I hope your appetite's been whetted and you will choose something which will suit you, but carry on learning about anger, and working with Professor Ray DiGiuseppe. Thank you so much to giving us your break hour between two classes. Really much appreciated. So guys, if you could put your cameras on and your microphones on and say thank you, I think it will be a nice gesture to thank Ray for his time.
Thanks very much, Ray.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to express my condolences on the loss of your queen.
Thank you very
People
much.
in America are very, very involved in being the TV everybody's watching.